Her German Shepherd was her world, but she couldn't save him. He was more than just a pet, he was her whole world. But when tragedy struck, Margaret thought she had lost everything, until an unexpected visitor changed everything. Watch. Till the end. The countryside stretched endlessly, a rolling canvas of golden fields and towering oak trees. Birds chirped in the crisp morning air, the soft rustling of leaves blending into the peaceful silence. It was a world untouched by the chaos of the city, a place where time seemed to slow, where the only companionship Margaret had was the loyal creature by her side. Margaret, an elderly woman with silver hair and warm brown eyes, had lived alone in her small cottage for years. Ever since her husband passed away, life had been quiet, too quiet. But she was never truly alone, not with Max by her side. Max, a strong and noble German Shepherd, had been with Margaret for almost a decade. He wasn't just her pet, he was her protector, her confidant, her only family. He knew her every routine, her every sigh, her every unspoken sorrow. And in return she gave him everything, love, care, and a home filled with warmth. Every morning, they walked together along the riverbank, following the same trail they had walked 1,000 times before. It was their time, a quiet moment of peace before the day truly began. That morning was no different. The sky was a soft shade of blue, the air crisp with the lingering chill of early autumn. Margaret tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she strolled down the dirt path, Max trotting faithfully beside her. The world around them was alive in the gentlest way. The scent of damp earth, the distant murmur of water flowing over smooth river stones, the occasional rustle of a rabbit darting through the underbrush, everything was as it should be. Margaret sighed contentedly, glancing down at Max. "Another beautiful morning, huh, boy?" she murmured, her voice warm with affection. Max responded with a gentle woof, his ears twitching as he glanced up at her. His amber eyes, filled with unwavering loyalty, softened as she reached down to ruffle the fur between his ears. To anyone else, it was just a simple morning walk. But to Margaret, these moments were everything. They were her comfort, her routine, her reminder that she was never truly alone. Then, without warning, Max froze. His ears perked sharply, his body tensed, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Margaret frowned, watching as his gaze locked onto a dense patch of bushes near the riverbank. "What is it, Max?" she asked, following his stare. There was nothing, at least nothing she could see. Just the wind shifting the leaves, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees. Max growled softly. Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh, don't be silly, boy. It's probably just a rabbit." But Max didn't relax. If anything, his muscles tensed even more. Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the bushes once more. There was a strange weight in the air now, something she couldn't quite place. But after a moment she shook off the feeling and gently tugged at Max's collar. "Come on, let's keep walking," she urged, her voice light, as if to dismiss the unease creeping up her spine. Max hesitated before obeying, his ears still pricked, his body moving stiffly. Even as they continued down the trail, he kept glancing back at the bushes, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. A few minutes later, they reached the clearing near the riverbank. Margaret stretched, breathing in the cool morning air, letting herself relax again. But Max didn't. His posture remained rigid, his gaze flicking toward the trees ahead. Margaret followed his line of sight and squinted. A shadow moved. It was quick, barely there, disappearing behind the trees before Margaret could get a clear look. Max let out a low, warning growl. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firmer than she felt. Silence. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Margaret took a slow step back. "Come on, Max," she whispered, gripping his collar. Reluctantly, Max obeyed, but his head remained, turned toward the trees as they made their way home. That night, Margaret sat in her armchair, knitting by the fireplace. The soft glow of the flames flickered across the walls, casting long shadows. Max lay by the door, his head resting on his paws, but his ears remained alert. Every few minutes he lifted his head, staring at the window as if he could sense something beyond the glass. Margaret noticed. "Still worried about those bushes, huh?" she murmured, setting her knitting aside. She walked over to him, kneeling down to stroke his fur. Max licked her hand, but didn't relax. Margaret sighed, pressing a soft kiss to his head. "You're my brave boy," she whispered. "Nothing's going to happen, I promise." She didn't know how wrong she was. As the night stretched on, Max remained vigilant. He paced near the door, ears flicking at every sound. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but Max wasn't fooled by the storm. He knew something else was out there. Margaret, exhausted from the day, eventually dozed off in her chair. The fire dimmed, shadows growing darker in the corners of the room. Max, ever watchful, lay at her feet, his body tense even in rest. Somewhere outside, beyond the house, something shifted. Max's ears perked. His muscles coiled. A sound, faint, deliberate, unnatural, cut through the wind. Max lifted his head, staring at the door. His body tensed like a drawn bowstring, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. But Margaret remained unaware, lost in the comfort of sleep. The night was silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves. Max didn't close his eyes. He couldn't. Something was coming. And this time, Margaret wouldn't be able to stop it. The morning air was cool and crisp, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as Margaret and Max stepped onto the familiar dirt path. It was their routine, their peaceful time together. Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging slightly, ears perked as he took in the scents of the countryside. Margaret smiled, wrapping her shawl tighter around her frail shoulders. "You always get so excited for these walks, don't you, boy?" she murmured. Max turned back, giving her a brief, affectionate look before bounding a few steps forward. But then, a sharp whimper cut through the quiet morning. Margaret's heart jumped. She turned around, eyes wide, just in time to see Max stumble. His strong legs wobbled, his body swaying unnaturally. "Max!" Her voice trembled as she rushed to his side. Max tried to steady himself, his claws scraping against the dirt, but his body betrayed him. His hind legs buckled and he crumpled to the ground with a weak thud. Panic surged through Margaret. "No, no, no, Max, get up!" She knelt beside him, her trembling hands reaching for his fur. Max's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling unevenly. His eyes, once so alert and full of life, looked hazy. Something was terribly wrong. Margaret placed her hands on Max's side, feeling the weak rhythm of his heartbeat. "Stay with me, boy," she whispered, voice thick with fear. Max let out a soft, pained whine. His body twitched as if he were trying to respond, but he was too weak. Margaret's mind raced. What had happened? He had been fine just moments ago. They had taken this walk 1,000 times. Nothing was different. Unless, had he eaten something? Something poisonous? Tears blurred her vision as she cradled Max's head. "You're going to be okay," she promised, even as her voice cracked. But there was no one around, no passing cars, no neighbors, no help, just the endless countryside and the sound of her own desperate breaths. She had to get him home. Margaret tried to lift Max, but he was too heavy. Her arms, weak with age, trembled under his weight. She could barely shift him an inch. "Come on, boy," she pleaded, "just a little more." Max whimpered, his body limp in her grasp. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. Forcing herself to stand, she turned and stumbled back toward the cottage, her legs aching with every step. The moment she reached the front porch, she flung the door open and grabbed her phone with shaking hands. She dialed the nearest veterinary clinic, her heart pounding against her ribs. A voice answered. "Please," Margaret gasped, barely able to speak. "My dog. He's sick. He collapsed. I don't know what's wrong." The receptionist's voice was calm but firm. "Take a deep breath, Mum. Is he breathing?" Margaret choked on a sob. "Yes, but it's slow. He can't stand." "Can you bring him in?" Margaret glanced toward the door, toward Max, still lying motionless outside. Her chest tightened. I can't lift him." There was a pause. Then, "We're sending someone now, but it will take time. Stay with him. Keep him warm." Margaret nodded even though they couldn't see her. "Please hurry," she whispered. Margaret rushed back to Max, kneeling beside him once more. She wrapped a blanket around his body, her hands running gently through his fur. His breathing was even slower now. "No, no, stay with me," she whispered. "You're my boy. My strong, brave boy." Max's eyes fluttered open just slightly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and weakly nudged her hand with his nose. It was as if he was trying to comfort her. Margaret let out a broken sob. "You're the one who's supposed to be okay," she choked out. "Not me, you." Max blinked sluggishly, his ears twitching ever so slightly at her voice. But he was slipping. She could feel it. The vet's truck pulled up moments later. A young man jumped out, rushing toward them with a medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Max, his face grim as he quickly examined him. Margaret held her breath, waiting, hoping. The vet's hand rested gently on Max's ribcage, feeling for his pulse. His brows furrowed. Then he looked up at Margaret, and in that instant she knew. His voice was careful but firm. "Ma'am, I think he's been poisoned." Margaret's heart stopped. She shook her head. No, that's not possible. I watch him. He never eats anything off the ground. He never—" "I'm sorry," the vet said gently. "But the symptoms match weakness, slowed heart rate, unsteady movement. He must have ingested something during your walk." Margaret's vision blurred. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Had she missed something? Had there been something in the grass, the water, something he had licked or eaten? Guilt crashed over her like a tidal wave. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for Max's paw. It was cold. How do I fix this?" she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what to do." The vet hesitated. "We can try treatment, but it depends on how much poison is in his system. If it's too much—" He stopped himself. Margaret gripped Max's fur. "No, don't say that. Just do something." Max let out a weak breath. His tail gave the smallest of movements, as if trying to comfort her. Even now, he was trying to be strong. Even now, he was trying to tell her it was okay. "Do everything you can," Margaret whispered fiercely. The vet nodded and immediately started administering emergency treatment. A shot to counteract the poison, fluids to keep him stable. Margaret stroked Max's head the entire time, whispering words of encouragement. "You're not going anywhere," she murmured. "Not yet. Not like this." But the vet's expression didn't change. His hands were quick, experienced, but there was a heaviness in his eyes, and Margaret knew. The cottage was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. The treatment was done. Now all they could do was wait. Margaret refused to leave Max's side. She laid down beside him, her head resting against his body, listening to his heartbeat. Slow, so slow. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She had never felt so powerless in her entire life. The vet finally spoke, his voice quiet. "If he makes it through the night, he might have a chance." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. She would stay with him. She would not sleep. She would not leave, because Max had always been there for her, and now she would do the same for him, even if it meant watching the only thing she had left slip away. The room was eerily silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Margaret knelt beside Max, her frail hands shaking as she stroked his thick fur. His breathing was slow and uneven, his once bright eyes clouded with pain. The vet worked quickly, preparing the antidote. His fingers trembled as he filled the syringe, aware that every second slipping by could be the difference between life and death. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Stay with me, Max. You're strong, my boy. You can fight this." She watched the needle pierce Max's skin, delivering the antidote that was supposed to save him. Hope flickered in her chest, but it was fragile, delicate, like a candle flickering in a storm. Max let out a weak whimper, his body barely responding. The vet pulled back, his face grim. "It's spreading too fast," he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. Margaret's heart clenched. No, he's a fighter. He's survived worse. She refused to accept the possibility that this could be the end. But deep inside, a terrible fear began to rise. Margaret's gaze met the vet's, searching for reassurance. Instead, she found sorrow. The look in his eyes shattered the fragile hope she had been holding on to. Tears welled up, but she blinked them back. This wasn't happening. Max had always been by her side. Through the loneliness, through the years when the world had felt unbearably quiet. He couldn't leave now. Her trembling fingers traced the soft fur on his head. "You can't go, Max, I need you," she whispered. Max's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The reality crashed into her like a wave. She was losing him. Margaret felt Max stir slightly. With great effort, he lifted his head just a little, his body weak, but his spirit still clinging on. His tongue brushed against her. Trembling hand, a faint, affectionate lick. Margaret choked back a sob. It was as if he was telling her everything she needed to hear, without a single word. He wasn't scared. He wasn't in pain anymore. He was grateful. Fresh tears spilled down her face as she cupped his face in her hands. "I love you. My boy, please don't leave me," her voice cracked. "Please." Max's eyes softened. Even in his final moments, he was comforting her, her best friend, her protector, her heart. Max took one last shuddering breath. Then he went still. For a moment, Margaret didn't move, didn't breathe. The world around her faded into silence. The vet placed a hand on his stethoscope, listening for a heartbeat. After a moment, he lowered his head, exhaling a quiet sigh of defeat. "He's gone." The words shattered Margaret. A strangled sob escaped her lips as she clutched Max's still body, her frail frame shaking with grief. He had been with her, through everything, her quiet mornings, her lonely nights, the years that had felt endless, and now he was gone. Her home, her life, her heart, it all felt unbearably empty. The vet reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Margaret." She barely heard him. Her world had become a blur of grief, a deep, aching void. Her hands trembled as she stroked Max's fur one last time. He was still warm, as if he was only sleeping. A broken whisper escaped her lips. "I don't know how to do this without you." Tears dripped onto his fur as she pulled him close, her sobs quiet and raw. The house once filled with his soft footsteps, his happy barks, and his presence, now felt suffocatingly silent. Guilt slithered into her chest, curling around her, heart like a vice. What if she had noticed something earlier? What if she had been more careful during their walk? What if... She replayed their last morning together, Max trotting beside her, sniffing the ground, nudging her hand. For a treat. Had he eaten something then? Had she missed a sign? She whispered into the silence, "I'm so sorry, Max, I should have protected you." But there was no answer, only the unbearable quiet. The vet's voice was gentle. "Margaret, would you like a moment alone?" She swallowed hard, nodding. Her fingers traced the curve of Max's ear, her tears falling freely now. "I'll never forget you, my boy." She pressed a final trembling kiss to his forehead. The weight of goodbye was unbearable, but she knew she had to let him rest. As she sat there, beside the only soul who had never left her side, a quiet thought settled in her heart. Max was gone. But the love they had shared, the years of companionship, the unwavering loyalty, that would never fade. She would carry him with her, always. The story was far from over. But for now, Margaret was left with an emptiness that could never truly be filled. And the question remained, how would she go on without him? The days after Max's passing were a blur. Margaret moved through her home like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in the unbearable silence. The house, once filled with warmth and companionship, felt cold and lifeless. She hadn't touched his things. His collar still rested on the table by the door. His bed remained in its usual spot near the fireplace, and his favorite toy sat untouched in the corner. She couldn't bear to move them. It felt like disturbing them would mean accepting that he was truly gone. At night, she still listened for the familiar sound of paws padding across the wooden floor. Every little creak in the house made her turn her head, hoping, just for a second, that it was Max. But it never was. She sat by the window, staring into the quiet night, whispering into the emptiness, "I miss you, my boy." The guilt weighed on her like a stone. What if she had noticed the signs earlier? What if she had been more careful on their walk? She replayed that morning in her head over and over, Max trotting beside her, stopping to sniff at something. Had that been the moment? Had she missed something crucial? The questions had no answers, but that didn't stop them from tormenting her. She found herself apologizing to him in the quiet of the night. "I should have protected you," she whispered. "I should have done more." But no matter how many times she whispered those words into the silence, Max wasn't there to forgive her. The day came when Margaret knew she had to lay him to rest. Keeping his body at home, though comforting at first, had only deepened the hike. She chose a spot beneath their favorite oak tree, the place where they had spent countless afternoons together. The tree's golden leaves swayed gently in the wind as if offering comfort. With trembling hands, she placed Max's favorite toy beside him. "You always loved this one," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt beside the fresh mound of earth, her fingers pressing into the cool soil. "Thank you for loving me," she whispered, "for being my family." A single tear fell onto the ground as she traced his name in the dirt. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but as she sat there, a quiet sense of gratitude settled. And she had loved him, and he had loved her. That was something death could never take away. Days passed, and the silence in Margaret's home remained. One evening, as she sat on her porch wrapped in an old blanket, lost in thought, a soft noise caught her attention, a faint rustling, a hesitant shuffle of tiny paws on the wooden steps. Margaret looked up. A small scruffy puppy stood at the edge of the porch. Its fur was matted, its ribs slightly visible beneath its thin frame. Its wide brown eyes stared up at her with a mixture of fear and hope. Her heart clenched. She hadn't been prepared for this. For a long moment, Margaret didn't move. Her first instinct was to look away, to close her heart off. The pain of losing Max was still too fresh, too raw. Could she really open herself up to another soul, knowing how much it hurt to lose them? The puppy took a hesitant step closer, its tail twitching. Margaret's breath caught. There was something in its eyes, a silent trust, a plea for kindness. Just like Max had looked at her the day she had brought him home. Her fingers twitched, her heart racing as she extended a trembling hand. The puppy hesitated, then slowly nuzzled its tiny head against her palm. Something cracked inside her. Tear slipped down Margaret's cheek as she ran her fingers over the puppy's dirty fur. It leaned into her touch, desperate for warmth, for comfort. She realized then, love never truly disappears. It doesn't end. It changes, it transforms, but it never fades. Max was gone, but the love he had left behind still lived in her. It was in the way she longed to comfort this fragile creature, in the way she felt her heart soften despite the pain. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You must be hungry." Standing slowly, she opened her door and glanced down at the small puppy. "Would you like to come inside?" It hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. Margaret set down a small bowl of food, watching as the puppy devoured it with eager bites. Its tail wagged ever so slightly, and for the first time in days she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't replacing Max. Nothing could ever replace him. But she could honor him. She could give love to another soul in need, just as Max had once given love to her. Reaching out, she gently scratched the puppy behind its ears. "We'll figure this out together," she murmured. The puppy let out a small, happy sigh and curled up beside her feet. Margaret wiped away her tears, a small, bittersweet smile forming. That night, Margaret sat on the porch again, the tiny puppy curled up beside her. She looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling like scattered diamonds. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air, the soft weight of the puppy against her leg. Then she whispered into the quiet, "I miss you, my boy." A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and in that moment she felt it, not just sadness but something deeper, a warmth, a presence. Max would always be with her, not in the way he once was, but in every act of love, in every moment of kindness, in every heartbeat that kept his memory alive. The pain remained, but so did the love, and that was enough to carry her forward.